right, once again, good morning, everyone. My name is John Stotts. I'm the Director of Adult Faith Formation here at Christ the King Catholic Church in Nashville, Tennessee. In Fratelli Tutti's latest encyclical, Pope Francis urges us to work toward, quote, a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amid disagreements and reservations, end quote. In the spirit of learning from one another, Christ the King is hosting a series aimed at hearing and learning from grassroots community organizations and fellow faith traditions about their work to achieve racial justice. The first two parts of this series, which we've entitled Learning from Our Neighbors, will feature some panel discussions, which I'll moderate with questions designed to help us understand and learn from our panelists. At any time, if you're participating live with us, feel free to use the chat function to ask questions, and I'll get to those when I can and raise any insights that you note. You can also use the hand gesture to signal that you have a question, and at a good moment, I'll try to call on you. We've learned over the last year that in a group, of any size, our best practice is to keep ourselves muted until we intend to speak. We've also learned that that's just good practice, even when we're out in the world. The church is not a gated community, and the church's mission extends from within, from the Eucharistic table, which is symbol of a world in which all are fed and wined and rejoicing in solidarity. It extends to the farthest reaches of society. To be human is to be in society. And so human evils are relational, social, political. The church's mission itself requires relational, social, and political participation in society to achieve its mission. This is why Pope Francis distinguishes, but does not oppose, what he calls elicited love, which he describes as being directed from individuals to individuals, and what he calls commanded love, which, to quote again from Fratelli Tutti, is expressed in those acts of charity that spur people to create more sound institutions, more just regulations, more supportive structures. It follows that it is an equally indispensable act of love to strive to organize and structure society so that one's neighbor will not find him or herself in poverty. It's an act of charity to assist someone suffering, but it is also an act of charity, even if we don't know that person, to work to change the social conditions that caused his or her suffering. This charity, which is the spiritual heart of politics, is always a preferential love shown to those in greatest need. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guests today because they exemplify what Pope Francis calls the spiritual heart of politics. Michelle Johnson comes to us from the Tennessee Justice Center, and Molly Williams is here to represent workers' dignity. It's our goal to learn from you as neighbors. So let me just start by asking each of you, beginning with Michelle, to briefly introduce yourself, give us a basic orientation to the work your organization is trying to accomplish and how you got involved in that work.
Hey, y'all. Thanks so much for having me. Honored to be with so many friends and many supporters who make this work possible. So I'm Michelle Johnson. I'm a Christ the King parishioner for 21 years now. My mom was one of the founding members in the 30s. She grew up in the parish, and feel called to do the work that I do every day, from homilies, good homilies, growing up at St. Anne's Parish, and amazing homilies confirming the hard work that I'm doing up to Father Dexter. So what we do at the Tennessee Justice Center is really three things. And our goal is to give every Tennessean a pathway to opportunity and dignity. And we do that in three ways. We help individuals navigate public programs so that they can actually access the services they need to thrive. For children, that means often making sure that they have appropriate health care and nutritional benefits so they can get a healthy start. For older folks, it means helping often them or their children navigate an incredibly complex system so that they can have long-term care and they can have a final chapter with peace and with dignity. So We have about 2,000 of those cases per year, and those come from every single county in the state. And we're really proud to have been around for 25 years. And that means that people, every year we have, last year I think we had 85 counties represented in those 2,000 calls. But if you take a span of like 3 years, it's 95 counties. So folks call us like Darius's mom, who was in Chattanooga, who's an honor student and a star football player, 11 years old, and he started having nausea and dizziness, and his pediatrician found that he had a brain tumor, sent him to Nashville to get that tumor removed, cancerous tumor removed, and he was on the gurney going into the surgery when someone checked his insurance status and found he was no longer eligible for TennCare Medicaid. So a wonderful social worker slipped his mom our number. His mom, like many people who are in our state who work low-wage jobs, their income fluctuates. They don't set their own hours. In her case, she was working 3 different jobs, all of which had fluctuating hours. And the public bureaucrats who were overseeing the program hadn't gotten the right information. But we were able to fix that. We were able to get him covered and get him the surgery, and he is now cancer-free. We're about 9 years later. So that's the kind of individual casework we do. Through those individual cases, we try to spot patterns so that you don't have to have heard of us or know of us to benefit from our work. And are about fixing the system flaws that any huge system would have. But oftentimes in the government, they aren't looking for, how do we make this better? How do we make this better? And we've kind of become that. My dad worked for a Ford Motor Company, and they actually had people telling them, what's wrong with this car? Tell us everything that's wrong with the car. Well, we've kind of become that for the state, which is like, here are the ways in which the desired mission of this program is not playing out because of a computer glitch or because of a vendor who doesn't understand the rules. And so those patterns include things like, most recently, a case that we have in federal court to stop the Medicaid block grant, which would be the end of Medicaid as we know it, and which would take away health coverage for so many families that we serve. Another system issue that we've been working on is the pandemic EBT program. So that's a program that will give kids who benefited from school lunch and breakfast, we'll give them $250 per child who are remote learning. And that's the government setting up that program did no outreach, and so families didn't know about it. And then when they did the outreach, implementing it was a problem. So those are a couple examples of system issues that we work on. And last, we try to leverage our freakish knowledge of these programs to help other nonprofits and other health clinics or food pantries. Oftentimes the laws are changing so rapidly in federal government and state government. So we, as lawyers, synthesize that, try to make it simple. We even have TikTok videos about a lot of this. I don't even know what that is. So if y'all know, good luck. But basically, how do we make the law simple so that people can do their own jobs, serve their own population, and then also, most importantly, maybe so that people can use their own voice when government is doing things in our name that violate our values. And so one of our big goals is making sure that people have a way to use their voice to demand more just policies around health and nutrition. So I'm going to pause there, but those are the big things.
Thanks, Michelle. A quick follow-up question before we turn to Molly. How many similar organizations to Tennessee Justice Center exist in Tennessee?
Well, I think we're the only one like us in Tennessee, in that we both serve individuals and we focus on the system. And so in some ways that's very unique. There's lots of folks that focus on the system, like ACLU. There's legal aid that focuses on the individual. What we do of bringing those two together is unique. I think TIRC, Tennessee Immigrants' Rights Coalition, does similar work in the area of immigration and justice around welcoming the stranger. But I don't think in terms of there's nobody else like us.
Yeah. It strikes me that to oscillate between the worlds of individual care and advocacy to the systemic view. I mean, frankly, it sounds exhausting, but also it must give you insights into both the wider patterns that you're talking about and how they affect or don't affect people on the ground. Yeah, it sounds complicated, but okay, well, yeah. We'll have more questions for you, but I'll turn it over to Molly right now so we can hear a little bit about workers' dignity.
Yeah, thanks, John. My name is Molly Williams. I'm grateful to be here with you all this morning, learning alongside you. As John mentioned at the beginning, I'm going into my 3rd year at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And I actually live in an apartment not far from Christ the King, so I feel like a neighbor, and I'm glad to be here with y'all this morning. I've been a volunteer with Workers' Dignity for about 2 years, and I recently served a year on our steering committee, which is kind of like a board. So I'll talk a little bit about how I first got involved, and then I've got some slides to kind of hopefully give us a better sense of what Workers' Dignity does. So I first got involved as soon as I moved to Nashville and started at the Divinity School. I heard from other students that some construction work had been completed for the new Divinity School that was recently built, and that the workers who did the concrete work and a number of other things hadn't been paid for their labor. So there was a project both at the Divinity School, and then the same team had done some concrete work at a middle school here, McMurray Middle School, and they had not been paid for their work. And so through one of the construction workers who did the work, his name's Armando, is now a good friend. And so through a public pressure campaign that Armando and a number of other workers led, and that Divinity students and alums supported, he was able to recover the wages he was owed for the project at the Divinity School. He and our team are still fighting for the nearly $40,000 that he's owed for concrete work at the public middle school. But that's kind of how I came into getting to know Workers' Dignity and being a volunteer, was through Armando and through this campaign at the Divinity School. And I think that will probably make a little more sense once I talk about what we do. So I've got some slides that I will click through. Let's see. One moment. Just share my screen. Here we go. Can you all see this slide here? Okay, great. So Workers' Dignity is a worker-led center organizing for economic justice and dignity for all. Workers' Dignity has been building worker power in Nashville through organizing and leadership development for over 10 years now. And if you're not familiar with worker centers, or if that's a new term for you, worker centers are often, they do a lot of different things, but they're often community-based organizations that provide support to low-wage workers in a variety of ways. And at Workers' Dignity, we use a community organizing model to create change, meaning that we build relationships that we facilitate people building relationships with each other, low-wage workers getting to know each other, connecting over shared struggles, developing leaders to take action alongside each other for economic and political change. And then our main program areas that I'll get into in a little bit are construction worker organizing, wage theft recovery, and our radio station. And I'll try to click through these pretty quickly. I think it should just take maybe 5 to 10 minutes. So we got started over 10 years ago in the aftermath of the 2010 flood. And in 10 years, workers have recovered more than $1 million in stolen wages. Since 2010, Workers' Dignity has served as a space where workers can band together to recover stolen wages and demand that companies take responsibility for everyone on their work sites. Our wage theft process, which I'll talk more about later, but it's driven by public action. So workers supporting each other to lead their own fights. The process usually involves a Defend Your Rights workshop taught by member leaders who have already kind of led their own campaigns. And then from there, workers are paired up with advocate teams involving members and volunteers who kind of accompany them through the process of a campaign. And so through this experience, everyone sees their wage theft campaign hopefully to the end and learns the kind of basics of building power together, best practices for recruiting other people, power mapping, research, things like that. One of our earliest campaigns that's mentioned here is the Just Hospitality campaign. So Nashville's hospitality workers, who are predominantly Latina, Egyptian, and Black women, some of the most routinely exploited workers in our city. And so from 2015 to 2019, cleaning workers at 13 hotels and a couple of other places joined together and won significant wage increases. They formed worker committees and took direct action together to improve pay, reduce the number of hotels rooms they had to clean, and win back stolen wages from cleaning agencies or from hotels directly. So that's kind of a closer look at one of our campaigns. Talk for just a minute about kind of our mission and structure. So we are, you can see here our mission statement, we're a worker center led by low-wage workers acting collectively for economic justice and dignity for all. We believe that people directly impacted by injustice have the knowledge and capacity to create sustaining and equitable change. And we are led by low-wage member workers, predominantly Latinx, Indigenous, and Black, and build power by organizing our fellow workers and allies. We train and support each other to build campaigns for economic, racial, and immigrant justice. And when I say we're worker-led, kind of what that means is that members of the organization who are leading are all low-wage workers who commit to organize alongside each other. And our steering committee, which is kind of like a board, is made up of at least 2/3 members of the organization, and all staff, so our co-directors and organizers, are accountable to that steering committee that has to be at least 2/3 members. That's just a bit more about the organizational structure. I'll kind of skip past this. And then finally, this is the second to last slide, our campaign areas. So I talked some about wage theft recovery, people coming to the Worker Center saying, hey, I've completed this work, but I haven't been paid. You know, what can I do? And kind of walking with people through that process. It's the same for workers' compensation if people have been hurt on a work site. And that second one, commercial construction campaign. So Nashville is actually the most dangerous city in the South for construction workers. So our construction committee is made up of workers and families with kind of visions for what the industry could and should look like and how to get there. And so this group of people is working towards a worker-driven social responsibility model, which other cities have, should create some kind of industry standards and hold the contractors and organizations that are hiring people to do construction work accountable to those standards. And then the last two, tenant organizing campaign. This is a more recent development as people have come to the center sharing that they're facing eviction or rising rent. And so working with people that live in apartment complexes or trailer parks around Nashville to figure out how to keep people in their homes. And then finally, I mentioned earlier our radio station. So we have a radio station where working class DJs share information about campaigns, play music, share about other community organizing work, host interviews, all on our radio station. And then the last slide, I think, let me save this for later. This is kind of ways to get involved that we talk about, but I think this question's coming up, so I'll hold off on that for now.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks for the slides. So a real quick question for you, Molly. Do you guys have an operative definition for what a low wage worker is? Is it primarily defined explicitly by income? Are there other factors you mentioned? That a lot of these folks are Black, Indigenous, people of color. How do you define what a low wage worker is?
Yeah, John, that's actually a great question. We don't have a kind of one or two sentence definition about like, this is the income level because it is hard to get at. We've talked about it. It used to, or I think in some industries, we understand it kind of an income level, but that doesn't, fully take into account things. I know y'all have been talking about the history of racism, who can own homes, who can't. So even if someone has a job with a livable wage now, if they've been kept out of owning a home or other kind of wealth accumulating pieces because of racism in our history. So we've kind of leaned away from saying this is the firm line for what a low wage worker is, and kind of understand it in a more nuanced way. So it's hard to give kind of a one sentence definition.
Sure, that makes sense. And it sounded like there wasn't kind of a checklist of here's how you know if you're a low wage worker. Well, let me pause real quick and solicit any questions that immediately strike folks who are with us this morning. I'll pause for about 10 seconds if you have something. Otherwise, I'll go into Jim, go ahead.
This is a question for Michelle. Michelle, in talking about the Tennessee systems that you deal with, could you speak at all to or give us examples of systemic racism that you encounter in some of the programs that your clients or the people you try to help encounter?
Sure. I mean, there is just the day-to-day policy decisions which are being made where racism is just slightly below the surface. So one example recently is the states around the country decided to put into place a work requirement provision so that in order to get health care, you would have to prove that you're working a certain number of hours. And we know from data that the vast majority of half of the people on Medicaid are children. Another huge percentage are seniors who are in nursing homes or in long-term care. So there's a small percentage who are adults who are parents. And so that's what that provision applied to, parents of children who are 18 and below. And we know from looking at that population that the vast majority of them work. They might not be working if they lose their job in a pandemic, but generally they're going between jobs and working oftentimes more than one job. But there was a push to put into place a program that was about if this person gets cancer and can't come to work and loses their job, then they'll lose their health care, which makes absolutely no sense. And the point of Medicaid, the whole point of the public program is to be a safety net. So when other private programs like health insurance, you lose that because you're sick and your employer sponsored coverage goes away, that Medicaid is there to catch you. The conversations around that policy in our legislature, it would be really hard to sit through those conversations and not see that just slightly below the surface is this sense of othering and dehumanizing the moms who are on this program, which, by the way, are disproportionately women of color because of 400 years of policies that made a wealth gap. But really, the vast majority of people on Medicaid in this population are white folks. So that's a quick example of there are constantly policy decisions being made to make it harder to have a safety net, as if, and legislators will say, these people are just making bad decisions. Well, the decisions that were made that were bad were 400 years of making it harder and harder for people to live and work and pray. 400 years of redlining and all of the other things that you've talked about that result in people of color being disproportionately likely to have less money and have less access to education, have less access to safety and all of those other things. So the folks that call us are disproportionately people of color. The the way that they are treated often by policymakers is to blame them for the fact that they and their ancestors don't have the cushion that, say, you or I did. If we had a crisis and we were 20 years old, oftentimes a parent or a grandparent can kind of get us through the crisis. Many of the families we serve do not have that cushion. And so I don't know, I've kind of rambling on, and we have this amazing resource on our website that says Black Health. It's, if you go to our campaigns, it's Black Health Matters, and it kind of lays out this complicated thing, which is both in the policymaking that comes up all day, every day to make it harder to access basic needs. And it is the fact that the people who are being served because of a million different policies and discriminatory actions, many of which the government took knowingly.
Thanks for that question. I want to follow up, and this is open to both of you. Something that strikes me about your response is that part of the narrative that I've experienced that kind of operates as a deep story, if you will, that justifies continuing to place obstacles to fair wages or access to good healthcare. It goes something like, these benefits should be directly proportional to how hard people are working or are somehow willing to work. So the sense that taking handouts is shameful, and and that the law certainly shouldn't be on the side of those who are willing to do nothing in order to achieve what so many hardworking white Americans have worked hard for forever to achieve. How would you push back against this narrative that these people that are in need are really only in need because they're not working hard enough?
It's false. It's demonstrably false. I think what's most powerful about that is that the people who call us, the 2,000 individual families that call us, every single one of them says, I'm not like those others. So that has been so beaten into every aspect of our conversation, that there are people who, if we need each other, then we must therefore be less than. We must therefore have done something that makes us undeserving. And the fact is, because we talk in great detail to each of these people, it's so clear about the millions of different ways they're contributing, and the millions of different ways that any one of us would be in worse shape than they were if we had the circumstances coming at us. And so, yeah, I think that narrative is uniquely American and is just demonstrably false. People are working very, very hard. And the vast majority of people want to work very hard. They don't have the ability to control how many hours they have. They don't have the ability to control if they can make a living wage, but they want work is meaningful to them. And if they don't, if they have a pathway to do that, they will do that. Even if it means they have to make sacrifices. So many of the folks that we work with on expanding Medicaid are folks who have worked in construction or home health. Waitresses, they've worked their entire life. They're now 50s, like a little bit older than me, and their bodies have completely given out because they've done back-breaking work their whole life. And now they're just trying to get some health coverage so they can get back to work, but they can't get the health coverage because of politics and this kind of sense of, we're not going to expand this public program because if we do, it might help people. There's a book called Dying of Whiteness. Jonathan Metzl, who is at Vanderbilt, he interviewed folks in rural Tennessee about why they were against the Medicaid expansion. And their answer was they would rather die without health care than have Black folk get the health care, because they thought that somehow that was giving something that was undeserved, that they didn't deserve, which is, I mean, just for a second, think about that. They would rather die without the healthcare they need than have someone else have the healthcare they need because of racism. So I'm going to let you go. Sorry to go on and on.
Yeah, Michelle, I totally agree with what you've already shared. And, people are quick to talk about handouts, but not willing to see, like, I can reflect on my own parents and grandparents and ancestors and think about the kind of the handouts or the ease that they had buying a home or going to college or higher education. but people, don't want to call that handouts. They want to call that hard work instead of governmental policies that have made it easier for 400 years for many white people to own homes or go to, higher education. And yeah, I would say everything that Michelle already mentioned, and that I'm just so struck by the structures and systems that make it so hard for people to stay in their homes, find a job with a living wage, find a job with proper safety, find a job where they're going to get paid. There are just so many policies and structures set up against people trying to stay in their homes, to work, to, be a part of their communities. And then you add, I think for workers' dignity, especially, you add immigration status and the kind of role that plays in bosses or landlords saying, well, we don't care about you, or being able to kind of brush people aside. So that's kind of another one that I think about that impacts our work too.
Thanks for that response. A follow-up question for you, Molly. As someone who even, this week has looked outside and seen, the people who are redoing the front entrance to our building are predominantly non-white workers. And knowing that I don't know who we hired or why we hired them, is it your experience that nonprofits, faith organizations like churches are better at dealing fairly with low-wage workers? And I also think about, your initial story about Vanderbilt, and there's a lot going on there, but I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think going back to that first story I was telling about Armando, kind of the way that it happened. So the Vanderbilt Divinity School and Metro Nashville Public Schools contracted with a head contractor who had a subcontractor who then contracted with Armando and his team. So and kind of that subcontractor said, oh, we'll get you a contract, we'll get you something in writing, that's coming. There weren't any policies in place for the general contractor or, at the time, MNPS or Vanderbilt to say, we need written contracts all the way down. So that when you have someone who's saying, hey, I'm owed $50,000, I'm having to refinance my car to pay people so they can, live and feed their families, you get people kind of passing the buck saying, oh, well, it's actually those people, that's the problem. We did kind of what we could do, but people further down the line, or, people kind of passing it off to each other. So I think that some of it comes not from not valuing workers, but just from thinking, oh, it's all set up, it'll work out. Like the policies must be there to pay people. And then you learn that it doesn't. And part of our kind of work with Metro Nashville Public Schools that has been successful is to get them to have a policy in place that says anyone we contract with, like, here's what we're going to need to see, or here's what we're going to require, so that we can't turn around, award another contract to someone that's then going to, somewhere down the line, be complicit in wage theft. So I think that some of it comes from people just not understanding kind of what that process looks like, but then often not willing to say, oh, we should have understood this process and we'll do what it takes to make it right. We'll take money from our, pockets to pay people if someone else isn't. So there is that kind of misunderstanding, but then often maybe an unwillingness to say, well, this is a flaw in our policy. We need to make this right. And I would say that's true of a lot of different places. It is, especially in Nashville, with how much construction there is, it is more often these kind of big developers and construction agencies, but we see it, in communities of faith or public schools or other things like that, certainly.
I'm going to ask you this because you're a divinity student and you're familiar with sort of our common, Christian tradition. As a Catholic, if I stole $40,000 from my employer, not only would I be fired, but the church would teach that I am in mortal sin, and if I died at that moment, conceivably I could suffer eternal punishment. If an employer steals $400 or $40,000 from an employee, who's culpable is that, or who's culpable for that? Whose sin is that, and who gets to go to hell for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like when you flipped it around saying, if I did this to my employer, this is how it would be seen. Right. I mean, I certainly think the employer, the contractor who has not paid their workers, knowingly, or a contractor who maybe then tries to say, oh, well, we didn't know, or oops, we'll do better next time. I'd say they're, culpable and should be held accountable to pay their workers, the employers, other people down the line who are trying to kind of pass it off to each other as the problem. I would say everyone kind of in that process, it's on them to make sure that people are paid, that as they're, and that's what we've kind of said. That was actually a big part of Armando's campaign, because we did have divinity students making the case for a moral obligation, even when people said, well, legally, it's actually those other people that have to pay them. We would say, okay, but morally, you're a part of this process. You were one of the kind of players in this chain. So where is your obligation out of a kind of sense of morality and care to make sure that these people are paid?
I would just say it's interesting to me how the power dynamic is different, because, if you were not paying $40,000 on a contract with people who have the ability to pick up the phone and get on the front page of the newspaper, you just wouldn't do it. But I think that part of this that's playing out is they think that these folks don't have any power to do anything. They're terrified to raise a stink about anything for fear of losing their safety or their home. And so that's the thing that feels complicated when people say, well, I just didn't know. It's like, well, yeah, but you would have known if you thought it was in your interest, or if there were a bunch of white folks who were like, you were going to see their parents at church or whatever, you probably would have found a way to know.
Michelle, as someone who belongs to this parish, and you narrated sort of part of your own story, what you shared is feeling a call to do this kind of work. What role, formally or informally, does your faith or the impact of religious tradition play in your efforts? I mean, it doesn't sound like this is overtly a faith-based organization, but I'm hearing a lot of the principles of Catholic social teaching and things behind it. So I'm curious how that informs you.
Well, I mean, originally it informed me because I wanted to spend my career making a difference and trying to find a way to live the gospel and be paid. And so I felt very strongly called to do this. Having done it now for 27 years, really my faith plays a role in reminding me, when you're up close and personal with so much suffering and really so much evil. I mean, there's an awful lot of evil in view if you are standing with people who have no power. It's like how to keep doing it. And the answer is in our faith, which is it's not supposed to be easy. If you're doing love right, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be really hard and really painful. And there's not going to be a lot of clarity about what the next steps are sometimes. And so I think my faith has been just powerful in reminding me of that if you're doing it right, it's going to be heartbreaking and exhausting and disorienting, and you just keep doing it because that's how you know you're on the right track. So I don't know if that answers the question. I feel like a gift from Father Dexter, having just when I need like a little booster shot to keep my legs steady, being in a good service with a great homily and just fabulous music, and also community, frankly. So many people on this call and in our parish and Catholics around the city remind me again and again that, like, I'm not alone. My coworkers and my clients were not alone in this, that there is, they aren't less than, they matter. And so that's it.
No, thank you. I mean, something that I love to ask folks who work in nonprofits who have been doing it for a while is how they manage to survive, because as we all know, the burnout rate is real and people can feel very unsupported and working against societal evil that shows no signs of going away. At best it changes its form. Molly, I'm curious for you, having gotten involved in advocacy for workers. I don't know anything about your background or whether you come from a working class family, but if you're in divinity school, I will be presumptive and think you're probably not a low-wage worker. What's it like working among low-wage workers? What's the power like? Can you see yourself doing this kind of work, as being in some sense an outsider to a lot of the realities that these folks are facing?
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I think that question goes back to what you asked earlier about, who's a low-wage worker, because while I'm in divinity school right now, I'm not working a job where I make a full salary. Still kind of the what we talked about, 400 years of history, and having parents who own their home and pursuing a graduate degree. So just like you said, it does feel like, and workers' dignity, I think, is really good because we do use a community organizing model, because from the beginning it's been worker led. So we have a lot of volunteers who support the work, but it is always like I think about even in our own team meetings, it's making sure that the people most directly impacted for whatever it is are kind of setting the course and deciding what's next. And of course, talking together and brainstorming together about different possible options, or thinking about who has the power and where we need to target, but always making sure that the people most impacted. So in most of our campaigns, low-wage workers are leading and making decisions, and that volunteers who are showing up to support alongside them for kind of what they ask and what they think is the right course. And so I think that that's a model, I think, especially for me as a white person who's not a low-wage worker, that's the model that I want to see people who are impacted leading the work, deciding kind of what's next, working alongside other workers to build power together, to kind of recognize how they can create change for themselves and for their communities. And then for volunteers who are showing up, we're very much a part of the team and of those relationships. Like some of my closest relationships are with folks at Workers' Dignity, but still making sure that we're looking and listening to the people most directly impacted to see what's next and kind of where the campaign should go. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow up, one of the things that Michelle mentioned that may allow, general contractors to inadvertently defraud their workers is that the workers themselves may not have the contractual power to advocate for themselves. What are the major obstacles, the other major obstacles to low-wage workers organizing in a variety of different work environments?
Yeah, I think the thing that Michelle named is a good one. It's huge power imbalance. There are a lot of, and maybe not the best person to speak to this, but just policies in our state, in our city, that very much side with contractors, with developers, that make it hard for workers to organize together. Worker centers, I mentioned at the beginning, are different from unions. So it's not, we have people coming in from a bunch of different work sites and workplaces. So we're not a union, and there are laws across the state, laws in our city, that make it really hard for workers to organize, for workers to challenge their bosses. So I think that that's probably the biggest hurdle and obstacle that we at Workers' Dignity face. Just the ways that capitalism and white supremacy continue to kind of shape and determine our labor laws and housing laws and immigration laws, that make it hard to, for people to organize and come together. And so we have to get creative with where we have power. I think about an action that we've done before when workers are recovering wages at a hotel. So after trying to kind of contact the management at the hotel, sending emails, phone calls, trying to set up a meeting, which is often met with like, not our problem, or people just don't answer. Sometimes a public action that we've done before, when the workers in the campaign, decide this is the next step, is having a wake-up call at 6 a.m. outside the hotel, standing on the sidewalk, drums and pots and pans, and people that wouldn't listen to you before, calling and emailing, when they have paying guests at their hotel, say, hey, what's happening? Why am I being woken up? I'm not going to keep staying here if this keeps happening. Then, they'll decide they can have a meeting or come to the table. So it is kind of about, thinking about where we do have power and how we can build power together against these huge obstacles and barriers that we face.
Thank you. Michelle, speaking of obstacles, if you had to list the biggest obstacles to your organization getting done what it wants to do, can you name two?
Well, I think funding, we have to raise our entire budget every single year. And having a team of people who are competent to do this really complex and emotionally and intellectually exhausting work, and that's steady and solid and often growing just with the national cost of living. And then the funding is something that's constantly changing. And so it's not really a model that makes for, peace and stability. We have made it work, but it's challenging. I think the other thing is just being heard, basically, everything is so polarized. Everything becomes so political, including even whether children should be able to go to school and not catch a deadly virus becomes this very political thing. And so oftentimes, because what we're talking about is somewhat complex, being heard over the kind of tribalism and the kind of knee-jerk reactions is difficult. And so what I say is, if I can get in a room with folks for 10 minutes and talk to them about an issue, if I can get the facts to people, they're almost always on the side of our clients. It's just getting the facts to people is really difficult, particularly with our budget, and when there are people on the other side who have unlimited resources and power who are drowning us out. We did a Instagram live about 10 days ago with Dr. Fiscus, who was recently fired from Department of Health because she was pushing getting children vaccinated. And we've been working on children's immunization really for all of our 25 years, because we know if kids get immunized that they do better and that they, that they can grow up to have a healthy start. And we've been working on that. Had a big court case where we had a settlement, and that's something we've always worked on, making sure children are properly immunized. So we were talking to her about not even just the COVID vaccines, but all immunizations for children. And Instagram said we were speaking about political items, and they deleted the video. And that's just one example in the last 10 days, but that happens again and again. And it happens, I think, uniquely in the South, where people don't they see what we're talking about today is very controversial and polite, and they don't want to hear that. Even if they think it's true, they just don't want to hear it. And so it's how to make sure people have the information they need to create a state that reflects our values.
Thank you. We have just a little over 5 minutes left. So I'll pause once again. Yeah, Jim.
Question for Molly. Does workers' dignity engage in policy? Most of the examples you've given us seem very much oriented on a specific wrong that you're trying to right. But it sounds to me like the issue of conditions for the cleaning women at all the hotels, it's not just one facility, it goes across the entire city. And so does workers' dignity try to affect policy at the community level?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jim. We absolutely do. So I mentioned at the beginning, kind of our theory of change is organizing. So we're not explicitly a policy organization, and that's not our expertise, but and the folks that we work with often don't, have a lot of legal protection. So the bulk of our work is focusing on organizing to hopefully create systemic change. And we absolutely use policy or relationships with, local politicians when necessary, when that can enhance kind of the vision for systemic change. And I think, I can't remember how much I talked about this at the beginning, but that worker-driven social responsibility model where our construction campaign is kind of hoping to go, would ultimately be a group of construction workers setting standards and kind of the guidelines that developers and contractors have to face. So I see that certainly connected to kind of policy and systemic change. But I would say our theory of change is really rooted in organizing and using policy and politics when it serves that. Yeah, does that answer your question? Does that make sense? Okay.
And I feel like I have a better answer for Jen's question if I have 2 minutes, which is Medicaid expansion is a program that every other state except for 12 states have already passed. And if you lay the racial data of the country on top of the states that haven't expanded, the states that haven't expanded are in states that are basically less white. So what we know is that the state government has made a decision. Governor Haslam tried to pass Medicaid expansion. He would have been able to cover 300,000 Tennesseans, mostly working poor folks, based on his budget at no cost to the state. There have been increasing incentives. Now we're paying $900 million. We're paying as Tennesseans to not take expansion. And that means we're number one in the nation at healthcare disparities in our country. Tennessee is number one at healthcare disparities. We're also number one at rural hospital closures. And so kind of that systemic racism, it's like, how do we get to policies that don't make any sense? Like that where a state would say, we're not going to take this money that our state needs because we don't have an income tax and actually give healthcare to those home health aides, or waitresses or construction workers. How do we do that? I mean, you can't understand that in any other way other than through systemic racism. And so, we continue to push for our governor to do what really anybody who understands math would have done long ago.
Yeah, and I would just add one example from my perspective too, from Workers' Dignity that I mentioned earlier. Armando's campaign at the school board, fighting for his wages at McMurray Middle School, and ultimately kind of showing up at enough school board meetings and confronting power in a way that I think makes some people uncomfortable. That did lead to the school board saying we need to change our policy. We need to make sure that going forward, this can't happen, that people are paid for their work. And though Armando still hasn't, been paid his wages for that project, that rooted in an organizing model in building power together, that still, is the end goal, and just kind of understanding how we get to some of that systemic change. Workers' Dignity is thinking it's through community organizing, but always looking for that systemic change, not just one-off, because we know that to kind of build the communities that we want and we need, that it is going to take big systemic change.
Thanks, Molly. A final question before we wrap up, and maybe we'll have more from some of our participants. But for those who are viewing this either right now or later on, and who are asking, okay, so what can I do? What's the next little baby step I can do? Are there 3 or 4 things that people can immediately do, and are there 2 or 3 things that maybe down the line, a parish or an organization can help, facilitate your work? Molly, we'll start with you, and I know you had a slide. Maybe you want to share that again.
Yeah, I'm happy to go back to that. The ways to get involved piece. I will say, when Michelle was talking about fundraising, that's always a huge, huge thing at Workers Dignity. Finding the money where we are really looking to be kind of grassroots funded. And so we have 2 fund drives a year, one that we're actually in right now. And we are, we're looking for people to give both in this month, but kind of the bedrock of our fundraising is our monthly donors. So that's always something that we mentioned. And our monthly donors, I think, range from the lowest being $3 a month to $250 a month. So that's always one that I want to name, because that's a real problem, like Michelle said, fundraising and finding the money. So that's one way. Another kind of quick thing to do would just be to sign up for our newsletter on our website. If you Google Workers Dignity, it'll come up. You can sign up for, I said newsletter, but I guess I mean our email updates. You're not going to get flooded with emails, but that's kind of the best way to stay up to date on our work and our campaigns and what's going on. And then a few other ways. So there's some kind of one-off ways. So joining for phone banking or letter writing in support of a campaign, showing up to an action in solidarity with workers. We're also always looking for people with language interpretation and translation skills, because a lot of our meetings, we need interpretation and translation. And then kind of finally, that piece at the bottom, join a committee. So we have our volunteer structures kind of split up into committees, with one being rideshare and childcare. So at a lot of meetings with tenants, or at our weekly wage theft nights, people bring their kids and we need someone to take care of them, hang out with them. So that's kind of a constant need. Same with rideshare for people who don't drive or don't have a car and that need rides. Faith community outreach, that's my beloved committee, and we work with faith communities who are looking to get involved, to kind of build relationships with them. And then the other committees that I'll just kind of run through quickly are communications, people helping with writing, our kind of outward facing comms work, research. A lot of our campaigns require a lot of kind of research on the back end, and we've got people really good at it who will train people if research is your jam. And then health and safety, that's kind of our workers' compensation, and then fundraising. So I'd say we're always really excited for new people to get involved in kind of whichever, wherever your skills or interests or passions are. We'd love to talk more about that.
Thanks, Molly. Michelle, how would you respond?
Yes. If you go to our website, tnjustice.org, there's a Get Involved pull down, and it has volunteer opportunities, and also on our campaigns, the Black Health Matters and Medicaid expansion, you can actually click a button and take action to make your voice heard. The volunteer Get Involved volunteer opportunities are all over the map, but we're always looking for ways for people to, we always have more to do than we can possibly do. I say we have a thimble full of resources and an ocean full of need. And so join us in the thimble.
Thank you. I lied. I have one more question, because I want to end with hope, selfishly, because I need it. So if this work, and we'll start with you, Michelle, if your work is successful, you get all the money you need, and you have 10 years worth of excellent work where you're getting basically everything you try, you achieve. What does 10 years from now look like for Tennessee if that happens?
Well, I mean, I think that every child has the ability to grow up healthy and find their pathway and thrive. That's one metric. That every older person in Tennessee has good quality care and doesn't suffer needlessly or be isolated from those they love in order to access healthcare. Those would be a couple on the health front, and then our nutrition work, just ensuring that no child is in school trying to focus on learning when they're hungry.
Thank you. And Molly, if God gives you everything you need,
that would be wonderful. Yeah, I would say, in the next 10 years, I think, especially in Nashville, with the way that it's changing, that our communities, especially Black, Brown, and working class communities, really run the risk of not being able to live in Nashville anymore because of skyrocketing housing prices, fewer jobs with living wages. So I would say that the next 10 years for us look like really fighting for a Nashville. And if we're successful, that is livable and enjoyable for our communities, where people can, where people really can thrive, where they can live and work and take care of each other without the constant stress of eviction, or of losing a job, or of losing wages. So I would say that our kind of big 10 years, our vision is a Nashville where our communities can take care of each other and can thrive without the kind of stresses that we're made to live under right now.
From your mouth to God's ears, as the saying goes. Well, Michelle and Molly, thank you so much for being present with us today. I feel like we could continue to have a conversation for hours and hours, and hopefully maybe you'll make yourselves available in different opportunities in the future, because we do have a vital group here at Christ the King who is trying to learn, and we're all coming at this from different perspectives. But our community has a lot of resources and a lot of goodwill. And often I think we just need a little wisdom to know how to direct that. So thank you so much for teaching us today. Any final comments or insights from other folks who are participating? Okay, well, let me just really quickly plug the next session in the series. It'll be Thursday night. You can find the Zoom link on our website, ctk.org. And there we will be hosting some more of our neighbors, these from local faith-based organizations, folks from some interdenominational fellowships who are going to help us to learn about how faith communities of color, Christian faith communities of color, are struggling with racial justice in Nashville. We'll have a representative from the Islamic Center down the street, as well as a representative from the Temple, one of the local Jewish synagogues. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation in which we continue to learn. If you look in the chat, if you're with us right now, the websites mentioned are available. I'll also make them available in the next weekly newsletter, as well as the recording of this session. So thank you all for your time, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed being with you all this morning.
Same. Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thank you all very much. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.